They told you not to watch it alone. They warned you it was based on true events. They said it made people faint in the theater. And yet, you kept watching. In the golden era of grindhouse shocks and whispered rumors from projection booths, some horror films didn't just market fear, they issued disclaimers. Not trailers, not taglines, but stark, unapologetic warnings. Statements printed in bold before the opening credits, posted outside theater doors, or whispered by trembling ushers. This film may disturb the weak-hearted. Viewer discretion is advised. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. From pseudo-true crime reenactments that blurred reality to occult thrillers that dared audiences to test their sanity, these films didn't just tell stories, they threatened to unravel you. And the wildest part? Most of them are now forgotten. Their warnings faded, their reputations buried. But their effects, panic attacks, emergency exits, public bans linger like a shadow no critic could erase. Tonight, we're not just revisiting film. We're unearthing psychological landmine. 15 horror films whose real-life disclaimers didn't just fail to protect the audience, they dared them to go further. Let's begin. Hasson, Mark of the Devil, 1970. Guaranteed to upset your stomach, and possibly your soul. No film in horror history weaponized the disclaimer like Mark of the Devil. From its tagline, positively the most horrifying film ever made, to its legendary distribution gimmick, barf bags handed out at the door, this West German witch hunt shocker sold itself on one promise: you will not be able to handle it. And many couldn't. Loosely based on historical inquisitions, the film features graphic torture, rape, branding, and execution, all depicted with relentless realism. There is no respite, no narrative arc of redemption, just cruelty institutionalized, righteous violence served cold. In the US, theaters were urged to post additional warnings, and some screenings required signed consent forms for underage viewers accompanied by adults. One city council in Ohio shut down a showing mid-film after 2 patrons passed out. But the most disturbing legacy of Mark of the Devil isn't its content, it's how easily we accepted the warning as part of the fun. As if the torture was tolerable so long as it came with a wink and a waiver. That's the final trick. When horror stops asking for your consent, and you give it anyway. I dismember mama. Vienas tūkstantis devyni šimtai septyniasdešimt du. He loved his mother, then he killed every woman who wasn't her. With a title like that, I dismember mama sounds like cheap exploitation. But what played in theaters was stranger, slower, and more deranged than its grindhouse peers expected. The film follows a recently released psychiatric patient whose Oedipal obsession escalates into a series of killings. Knowing the content might repel even hardened horror fans, producers did something rare. They distributed the film with a printed warning sealed in an envelope, handed to each viewer individually. The envelope read, "For your eyes only, this film may be too shocking for the average audience." Inside, a psychological profile of the killer, and a liability waiver. Some viewers laughed it off, others clutched it throughout the screening, because the film doesn't justify its title until the final act, and by then, it's too late. What you expected to be trash turns into something colder, the slow rot of obsession, and you're left wondering whether the warning was for you, or for the characters trying to escape his mind. #3. The Legend of the Witches, 1970. This is not a film, this is a ritual caught on camera. Banned, censored, and whispered about for decades, The Legend of the Witches is a pseudo-documentary that claims to chronicle real occult practices across England. From interviews with modern witches to reenactments of ancient fertility rites, the film blurs anthropology and invocation. Though dry in tone, its content unsettled even the most stoic viewers. The film doesn't warn, it informs. And in doing so, it invites participation. Some screenings reportedly ended with audience members claiming to feel altered, observed, or called. Critics dismissed those accounts, but theaters didn't. At least 3 venues in the UK required printed disclaimers warning that certain symbolic sequences may disturb spiritually sensitive individuals. There's no jump scare, no monsters, just knowledge delivered with quiet certainty. And as one reviewer wrote, the horror is not in what they do, it's in how calmly they believe it. Because some films don't scream, they whisper and wait. Raute wir, Snuff, 1976. They said it was a movie. But the screams weren't acting. Snuff wasn't made with a disclaimer, it became one. Originally a low-budget exploitation film called Slaughter, the final moments were reshot to include a scene where the camera accidentally keeps rolling as the crew brutally murders an actress for real. It was staged, of course, but the marketing didn't say that. Instead, posters screamed, "The film that could only be made in South America, where life is cheap." A bold-faced lie, but an effective one. Rumors exploded that the film captured a real murder. Theater owners were bombarded with questions. Protests erupted. Some cities banned it preemptively. Others required disclaimers saying, "No actual death occurred during the making of this film," but by then, the damage was done. People watched anyway, not because they believed it, but because they weren't sure, and that sliver of doubt, it's all the film needed. #5. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. They said it was fake. Then why were the actors missing? Perhaps the most infamous example of a film that needed a disclaimer and gave one too late. Cannibal Holocaust opens with a documentary crew disappearing in the Amazon, and what follows is a found-footage nightmare of escalating violence, colonial arrogance, and moral rot. Its realism was so convincing, director Ruggero Deodato was charged with murder. The actors had signed contracts agreeing to disappear from public view for a year to sell the illusion. Only after presenting the living cast in court did Deodato avoid prison. The film opens with minimal warning, just a note about the footage being recovered. But by the time it was released, many screenings were required by local governments to include printed or spoken disclaimers, warning of graphic content, sexual violence, and animal cruelty. Yet the question lingered. Was the warning sincere, or was it part of the show? Because by the end, what you remember isn't the gore. It's the feeling of complicity. You watched, you stayed, you couldn't look away. And the camera? It never flinched. #6. House on Straw Hill, 1976. The manuscript was unfinished, so was his mind. House on Straw Hill doesn't open with a disclaimer. It doesn't need to. The entire film feels like a warning in progress, one you've already ignored. Also known as exposé, it centers on a reclusive author suffering from paranoia and violent hallucinations while working on his next novel. As the film unfolds, it becomes increasingly unclear what's real, what's imagined, and what's waiting just outside the door. The violence is explicit, the sexual content is more disturbing than titillating, and the atmosphere, suffocating. It's not just what's on screen, it's what's beneath it. Upon its release, House on Straw Hill was banned outright in the UK and became one of the most notorious video nasties. British censors eventually allowed a heavily edited version, but not before requiring a printed disclaimer, emphasizing the film's intensely disturbing psychological themes. Yet, for all its controversy, the most upsetting moments are the quietest. The long silences, the glance in the mirror, the page that won't write itself. Because madness doesn't announce itself, it seeps in, frame by frame. #7. The Mephisto Waltz, 1971. A pianist dies, a man takes his place, but whose hands are really playing? The Mephisto Waltz opens without fanfare, without warning, just a sense of something off in every frame. A fading musician is offered a second chance at fame, but only by accepting a Faustian pact involving soul transference, occult rituals, and an elite circle of satanic devotees. What disturbed audiences wasn't the plot, it was the tone. It's elegant, sleek, and strangely intimate. The rituals aren't grotesque, they're whispered, bathed in gold light. Death isn't frightening, it's seductive. Despite no on-screen disclaimer, advance press materials warned the film may not be suitable for spiritually sensitive audiences. Several churches protested its release, and some theaters were advised to include a verbal disclaimer about ritual content, but none of that stopped curious moviegoers. And once the final frame hit, with a child's body now carrying a dying man's soul, the silence in the theater said everything. Sometimes evil doesn't scream, it just plays beautifully. #8. The Witch Who Came from the Sea, 1976. She smiled through the blood, and no one questioned why. No official rating, no content warning. Just a poster of a woman rising from the sea, waves crashing around her, eyes vacant. Behind that image was one of the most uncomfortable portrayals of trauma, delusion, and vengeance ever committed to film. The Witch Who Came from the Sea tells the story of a woman whose childhood abuse fuels a series of violent, sexualized murders rendered through surreal, dreamlike sequences. The subject matter is taboo: incest, psychological breakdown, fantasy merging with homicide. Because of its themes, the film was immediately labeled a video nasty in the UK, one of the earliest to be seized under obscenity laws. In the US, some screenings quietly appended verbal warnings before the feature began, others didn't, and faced walkouts and protests. But here's the twist. Despite the content, the film remains strangely hypnotic. The lead performance is delicate, even empathetic. The violence is sudden, but not exploitative. It leaves you unsure if you just watched horror, tragedy, or a hallucination shared by a wounded mind. And maybe that's why the warnings came too late. #9. Last House on the Left. 1972. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie. No horror film disclaimer has echoed louder or more desperately than the marketing mantra for Last House on the Left. Plastered on posters, whispered in trailers, even looped on radio ads, the phrase became a nervous chant. Wes Craven's directorial debut didn't just challenge viewers, it taunted them, daring them to watch what they claimed they couldn't handle. Based loosely on Bergman's The Virgin Spring, the film presents a brutal story of abduction, assault, and revenge. But it wasn't just the content that disturbed, it was the tone. The raw, documentary-like visuals, the dissonant music, the jarring shifts from violence to absurd comedy. Test screenings were disastrous. Audiences fled the theater. Some vomited. Others reportedly tried to stop the projection entirely. Several cities refused to screen it unless warnings were added. In a few regions, police were stationed at screenings to prevent unrest. The disclaimer became a shield, but it didn't soften the impact. It just made people wonder what they were being protected from. And when they finally saw it, they realized it wasn't just a movie. 10. The Legend of Hell House. 1973. The house didn't need ghosts. It had history. The moment the film begins, a cold, clinical warning appears. A team of physicists is entering one of the most haunted structures in history. The characters speak in data points, electromagnetic pulses, and energy fields, but the air is thick with something language can't explain. The story follows a group sent to investigate Hell House, where multiple deaths, disappearances, and breakdowns have occurred. What sets The Legend of Hell House apart is its tone of scientific detachment. The opening warning feels like a case file. The dialogue is clipped. The explanations feel rational until they don't. And just as the viewer begins to question the line between psychic residue and madness, the film swerves into the unexplainable. Though not graphic, the film's oppressive atmosphere drew real concern. One London newspaper reported multiple viewers fainting during its second week in theaters. Some screenings reportedly opened with a disclaimer about the psychological impact of the content, not official, but quietly encouraged by theater staff. Because sometimes, the most dangerous spirits aren't floating above your bed. They're waiting for you to believe they're not real. Hassonon, Death Dream, 1974. He came home from war, but something else came with him. Before the opening credits, Death Dream delivers a jolt of reality. Dedicated to the psychological scars of Vietnam veterans, it's both a ghost story and a socio-political warning. The film reimagines the classic The Monkey's Paw tale. But this time, the dead son returns from war changed, silent, and inhuman. Though not accompanied by a visual disclaimer, Death Dream was promoted with press releases stressing its emotional intensity and mature themes, urging caution. Early audiences weren't prepared. Many thought they were walking into a zombie flick. What they got was a grief-soaked descent into trauma, addiction, and denial. Screenings in military-heavy towns were met with discomfort, and some VA groups issued internal advisories recommending against attending the film. The horror isn't in the blood, it's in the numbness. In a mother's refusal to see the rot, in a father's slow unraveling, sometimes death is kinder than what return. Hasson 2. The Baby, 1973. He was 21 years old. He wore a diaper, and he never said a word. The Baby opens without a single warning. No rating tag, no pre-title disclaimer. Just a gentle, almost TV movie-like tone that slowly mutates into something unclassifiable. The film follows a social worker who takes on the case of a family raising a fully grown man as an infant. What begins as uncomfortable slowly devolves into the grotesque infantilization, restraint, possible abuse, and a final act that reverses every assumption you had. Though no formal disclaimer appears on screen, reactions to early screenings prompted theater owners to post handwritten warnings on lobby doors. Critics couldn't decide whether the film was exploitation or subversion. Audiences weren't prepared either way. Walkouts were common. A few newspapers even published letters urging local theaters to pull the film on moral ground. But the most chilling part? The performances never wink at the absurdity. They lean in. It's a horror film that dares you to laugh until you realize you're the one being examined. And by the end, the question lingers. Who was really disturbed? The characters or the audience? Hasson 3. The House That Cried Murder, 1973. She planned the wedding, she staged the betrayal, but she didn't write the ending. There was no official disclaimer before The House That Cried Murder, but there might as well have been. Advertisements hinted at psychological content unsuitable for certain viewers. The trailer whispered warnings instead of shouting them, and by the time audiences realized what kind of film they were in, it was too late. On the surface, it's a revenge thriller. A woman left at the altar seeks retribution, but beneath that premise is a maze of mental collapse, twisted identity, and unspoken trauma. The film lures viewers with melodrama, then traps them in a slow, suffocating descent into emotional hell. The camera lingers just a little too long. The silence lasts just a second more than it should. Audience reactions were divided. Some walked out, claiming it was too sick to be entertaining. Others argued it was a rare glimpse into female rage unfiltered by genre tropes. But nearly all agreed, the marketing undersold how deeply uncomfortable the movie really was. This wasn't horror with blood, it was horror with intent, and it reminded us, you don't need a monster to feel terrified. Sometimes, a broken promise is enough. Raute 14. Deranged 1974. He dug her up because he missed her smile. He kept her because he couldn't bear her silence. Inspired by the life of infamous murderer Ed Gein, Deranged begins with a stark warning: this is based on a true story. Some of the events have been changed out of respect for the dead. The film doesn't waste time with suspense. Instead, it invites viewers to live inside the mind of a man who exhumed corpses, talked to skulls, and dressed his home in human remains. Unlike other horror films of the time, Deranged feels clinical, intimate to a fault. It offers no comfort, no stylish filter, just dirt, rot, and psychological decay. That rawness is precisely what prompted the need for a disclaimer. It wasn't just gruesome, it was invasive. People didn't feel like they were watching fiction, they felt like they were complicit. Test audiences were shaken. Theaters debated whether to show it at all. Some chose to attach an extra disclaimer on the poster, while others dimmed the lights only halfway during screenings. But the most haunting thing? It wasn't the mutilation. It was realizing how quiet it all felt, how normal. Because real madness doesn't scream, it waits in the silence. Hasson 5. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 1976. In Texarkana, they still lock their doors early, not because of the crimes, but because of the movie. Before a single frame appears on screen, the voiceover warns, "The incredible story you are about to see is true." Where it happened and how it happened is only known by a few. That ominous line sets the tone for one of the earliest horror films to blend documentary with dramatization, a strategy that blurred fact and fiction until neither felt safe. The Town That Dreaded Sundown recreates a series of real-life killings from 1946, committed by an unidentified assailant known only as the Phantom Killer. The choice to present the film as semi-documentary, complete with narrator and geographic precision, lent it a grim, almost forensic authenticity. Audiences didn't just watch, they panicked. Local protests broke out in Texarkana. Survivors and families of victims publicly condemned the film, claiming it exploited their trauma. But what disturbed viewers most wasn't gore, it was how the film framed itself as a public service announcement, a warning etched in celluloid. And despite that disclaimer, or maybe because of it, the legend of the Phantom Killer was reborn. Sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the shadows. They're etched into the town's memory, with a date and time stamp. Bonus pick. Before we wrap, here's one more horror film you need to add to your list. Don't Look in the Basement, 1973. They were patients, they were doctors, they were dead, or maybe they were all three. No opening narration, no warning. Just a woman arriving for her first day on the job at a remote sanitarium where nothing is labeled roles, intentions, boundaries. What starts as a textbook, low-budget shocker slowly peels back into something more unnerving. A story where structure dissolves, and no one inside the house, not the staff, not the patients, not even the audience can tell who's in control. The film was originally titled The Forgotten, a name far more fitting in hindsight. Directed by S.F. Brownrigg, Don't Look in the Basement never achieved the fame of its grindhouse contemporaries, but it inspired something more persistent: urban legends. Rumors spread that several patients in the film were not actors, that scenes were filmed inside an actual abandoned asylum, that the basement set had been condemned twice. None of that was true, but it didn't matter. Theaters that showed the film began placing warning signs not from the distributor, but from experience. One marquee in Kentucky allegedly read, "You've been warned. We warned them too." Another local paper described patrons sobbing in the bathroom. But the real damage came later after the film ended, because the final scene doesn't answer questions. It erases the ones you thought you had. And once you've seen the basement, you start wondering what else was supposed to stay locked down there. So, were the warnings real, or were they just another layer of the illusion? We've only scratched the surface of horror's most controversial cautions. If you've ever walked out of a film or wished you had, tell us which one left you unsettled long after the lights came up. There are more forgotten reels to uncover. If you dare, stay with us.